So recently I got into Tokyo Revengers and I kind of binged the entire thing, but much like with Attack on Titan in my first video that I made of that on this channel, I wanted to talk about the ending because it's just such a mystery, but at the same time, I think that I've pinpointed exactly what could happen. And at the very least, if I'm wrong, I think it's a really cool idea regardless. And because I'm so late into getting into the fandom, because this is literally the last arc in the manga, so by the way, manga spoilers, I mean, I'm talking about the ending, so I feel like that's a given, but still. I decided to search up my little theory online to see, okay, of course people have already thought of this, right? But it turns out not really. Almost nobody had. I've seen one person actually have the exact theory that I did, and another person was on the right track, but just not there. But as the thumbnail and title may indicate, this is talking about Mikey's older brother, Shinichiro, and how saving his life will fix the entire series to create that perfect timeline. And at first I thought this was going to be a very short video, but once I break everything down, I think this will be pretty long, because the theory itself is pretty standard, right? It's a very short, dry and cut theory, but as you explain how everything gets fixed and solved, you have to go through each gang and each character, and so I'm gonna do my best to talk about everything that matters to me at the very least. But before we get into how saving his life affects the future, let's just talk about how do we save his life? I mean, his death was like about 15 years in the past from the present day. I don't know the exact date, but it doesn't matter. It's before the time Takemichi goes back in the past, right? However, that may have been the case before, but now we know that Takemichi can go back in the past at different times. Because at first it was the simple 12 years, like on the dot 12 years. But now, going back in time with Mikey, he goes back 10 years. So what's going on with that? Either there's a few different ways to explain. We don't really know the exact like how his powers work, but at the very least it can be explained in multiple ways. One of which is it's just by person. Takemichi and Naoto go back in the past exactly 12 years, and that's how their time travel works. But Takemichi and Mikey go back 10 years. It could work like that, or potentially it's how far you want to go back in time. So because they were so used to going 12 years in the past, that's where it sent them. But with Mikey and Takemichi, they were kind of just thinking, okay, let's go back, like just anywhere but now. But who knows? That it's kind of unclear. But regardless of all that, we know that Takemichi and maybe Mikey as well, we don't know if Mikey's actually gone back in the past. It seems like he has some kind of awareness. And Takemichi has gained some like premonition power as well. This power is so confusing and kind of convenient in a way. But regardless, with all that, we know not only does Takemichi know the future while he's in the past, but also he can go back in the past at different times. Which means he could very easily, well, he could very well, maybe not easily, he could go back in the past to save Shin, or Shinichiro, Mikey's older brother. But I'll just be saying Shin because it's easier, and I'm tired. So all he'd have to do is instead of going 10 years or 12 years, he could go 15 or however many years he'd have to go back. Because I don't know if we get exact dates on this. The issue with this series, and not necessarily the series, but with this theory is piecing the timeline together, because I don't believe that we get actual dates to the flashbacks of everything, which is, it's a little, I wouldn't say frustrating, but it's difficult because that is what this entire theory bases off of. It talks about the flashbacks of everybody to see how they're affected by this. So we don't know the exact timeline of everything, so I'm just going to say 15 years, and we're going to say that's like the culmination of everything. Because saving Shin's life will save everyone else's. It will create the perfect timeline. But let's talk about the actual event itself. Because as you know, Kazutora and Baji go into a bike shop to try and steal the sweet supreme bike that Mikey likes, that I'm not going to search up the name of because I don't care. But he likes that sweet motorcycle, so they're going to steal it. But little do they know, that is Mikey's older brother's bike shop. And Kazutora decides to just hit him right over the side of the head and murder his ass right there. And so with this, Takemichi now in the past, let's say he goes back in the past somehow, whether he went 10 years in the future, then 15 in the past, or while in the past he just goes another couple years. It doesn't matter how he gets to this point, but let's say Takemichi goes back into the past to Shin's death, and he stops it. One of two things could happen here. Either he stops it in the moment, and that could definitely be true, but I like an alternative where this is a couple days prior. And coincidentally, this lines up with the day that he saves Hina from the bullies, or whoever was attacking her, which is also the day that Kisaki watches Takemichi become his hero. But in order to save Shin, he can't save Hina, and thus she has to fend for herself, or rather, Kisaki saves her, maybe, if he decides to. I don't know if this is the meeting point for Takemichi and Hina, but regardless, I do think that their relationship would be severely damaged because of this moment. Because if he has to leave to save Shin, and he doesn't do that superhero moment with her, then that completely changes their relationship. And I do think that Kisaki would swoop in, save the day, or at the very least, over time, get closer with Hina, and thus those two might end up together. Which means Kisaki would never actually go bad. He would never turn into a delinquent or anything. He wouldn't become a villain, which means that any gang that we've seen Tomen fight, their strength would be like cut in half basically, because he wouldn't be there gathering members for them. So because of this moment, Kisaki would never become evil, and most likely he'd end up with Hina, which I'm fine with Kisaki ending up with Hina, but I don't like Hina being with him. I want Hina to end up with Takemichi, but you know, a man's got to make some sacrifices, I guess. At the end of the day, she's going to be living, and that's all he really cares about. I mean, in the original timeline, he wasn't with her, so. However, from here, I think Takemichi would have a conversation with Shin, and it'd be interesting to see if he'd recognize Takemichi. Because there's been the whole, oh, is there a second time traveler? Which at this point, most likely not. But it would be cool if, for some reason, maybe an unexplained reason, perhaps he had premonitions, or Shin was a time traveler, but it'd be interesting if he knew who Takemichi was. That would be pretty cool in my opinion. But regardless, doesn't matter. Takemichi finds him and saves him, warns him, hey, there's gonna be some punks, stay prepared, do not let them sneak up on you, blah, blah, blah. Keep it on extra lockdown, or hide the bike, or give it to Mikey. He saves Shin from his death. And now let's talk about the consequences, because there are a lot of them. Shin living changes the entire series completely. And I'm going to go arc by arc talking about this. But before I do, I want to talk about if Takemichi would die or not. Because I'm honestly really split on this. Because I think a lot of us thought by the end of the series, first of all, Mikey might be the villain, which that is kind of the case, but also that Mikey or Takemichi will die by the end of it. And at this point, Mikey probably won't die, especially with this theory. There'd be no reason for him to die. That would just be shitty writing. But Takemichi has said multiple times saying that he would die for whatever cause. He is going to do this, and like, he keeps telling the villains to beat him down until he can't get back up, until he is dead. And so I think that may happen at some point. I don't think that he is going to push Shin out of the way and get hit by Kazutora, because that doesn't solve anything. Kazutora still becomes a psychopath, Baji still goes to jail, and all of that. Their problems aren't solved. We need the perfect timeline, which in the end means Kazutora does not hit anyone. He doesn't kill anyone. Maybe hurts, but he doesn't kill anyone. And so I don't think that Takemichi could die here. He might die at a later point though, if he dies at all. But like I said, let's go arc by arc talking about what exactly this changes, because there's kind of a lot. So starting off with the Tomen arc, to be honest, I'm not even sure if Tomen would exist in this timeline because of Mikey's brother living, because Shin lives. He tried to pass on Black Dragon to Mikey, I'm pretty sure, which I don't exactly remember what happened with that. So either Tomen doesn't exist, or it still does, or the main group is now Black Dragon and they're not corrupt anymore. I don't really know what would happen from this, but most likely Tomen would either exist or they'd go under Black Dragon's name, and it would essentially be the same group. Because I'm pretty sure Tomen existed before Shin's death, like way before, but it was just a small little like 5-man group or 6-man group, whatever. But with this, most likely they'd migrate to Black Dragon, or they'd stay their separate group. It really doesn't matter. Black Dragon wouldn't be a threat regardless. It would most likely be taken over by Shin once more, or potentially it would be given to Izana instead of Mikey. But we don't really know. And because in this timeline, Izana most likely would not turn evil. As much as I would love it if he still is evil, it doesn't really make any sense for him to become evil, because the Shin, much like with Mikey, he was keeping Izana's like dark side kept up and like all locked in a little box. So even though he hated Mikey, he wasn't going to do anything that dangerous and bad because Shin was still alive. So Shin living would solve his problems. And I'm kind of getting ahead of myself with him, but I wanted to talk about it right now anyway. But anyway, Tomen might exist in this timeline and might not. I'm not exactly too sure. But regardless, moving on to the Mobius arc, the leader is Hanma, or the former temporary leader according to the Wikia, which this Wikia isn't that great. So, you know. But in this member list, we see there's temporary leader and 8th leader. There doesn't seem to be any like actual leader. It's been a little bit, so I could be forgetting, but maybe there's a hidden leader here somewhere, but I don't know. It doesn't matter. Mobius would still exist, but their entire power would be cut in half because Kisaki wouldn't be a part of their group anymore. Because Mobius is formed of 2 generations, those born in 1988 and 1990. Kisaki's group that he joined up with Mobius was born in 1990, and so that's a good half of that gang completely cut off, which means Mobius wouldn't even be a threat, and Hanma might lose, honestly, like just might get beat outright, or he'd get beat, slither his way over to another group that we'll mention in a little bit. But after that, we have the Valhalla arc, which actually we don't because Kisaki isn't around anymore to make Valhalla, and thus, like, because the top 3 leaders are Kisaki, Hanma, and Kazutora. Kazutora in this timeline didn't go evil and thus is still with Mikey in his side, and he's still with whatever gang Mikey's in. Baji doesn't go undercover to take out, who was it? Who was he trying to take out? Right, no, so he wasn't trying to take out anybody. Baji joined Valhalla to get info on Kisaki, which he wouldn't have to anymore because Kisaki wouldn't be a threat. But anyway, none of the top 3 would really be there other than Hanma, but again, he would have just got his ass beat. So there are the other captains, but I don't think that they would really be a thing in this. And so Valhalla just simply wouldn't exist. Black Dragon arc most likely wouldn't happen because Black Dragon's history is going to be completely changed, and I can't really predict what would happen with that, so I'm not even going to try. Moving on to the Tenjiku arc, this is the first arc that potentially doesn't get completely wiped out from history, because it all depends if Izana is going to remain evil or not. Most likely he won't, but there's still a lot of characters introduced in this arc and in Tenjiku. For example, Kakachuo Hito, Ran Hitami, Kanji Mochizuki, and I think Shion Madarame. Those are a couple key players that we'll be talking about in a little bit. But the Tenjiku gang might not actually exist because I believe it was formed by Izana. I know he's the leader. I don't know if he made it though, but most likely he did. But now we have the Boten arc, which takes place in the future because evil Mikey goes and creates, like, it's not even a gang anymore, it's just a criminal organization, which that wouldn't happen because he doesn't go evil because his older brother is alive to keep the darkness within. Actually, there wouldn't be any darkness at all because his brother didn't die. And so now we're moving on to the final arc, the 3 deities arc. And this is where things get a little interesting. This is where I wouldn't say the theory breaks, but at the same time, it just, from a writing perspective, it doesn't make too much sense. Because the 3 deities is this arc. This is the final arc. So they have to be involved in the ending somehow. And after a little bit of thinking, I found a way. Just for a little refresher, the 3 deities, the big 3 gangs, were formed after Tomen disbanded in the past, present, whatever. After Mikey disbanded Tomen, there was 2 years of kind of unsettled, whatever, it was kind of just chaos, and thus these 3 gangs rose up and became powerful. One of which is the Kanto Manji gang, which is led by Mikey, which means that gang wouldn't exist at all, so we can just erase that one from history. Then we have the Brahmin gang, which is made by Senju, which I will be bringing her up in a bit. But she wouldn't have any reason to form this gang, because the only reason why Brahmin exists is to take down Mikey's gang, the Kanto gang, which won't exist because Mikey isn't evil. So Brahmin wouldn't exist. However, Rokuhara Tandai, the last of the 3, still might. And although this gang was formed because Mikey's gang Tomen had disbanded, I do think that this formation, or a similar gang of sorts, could still be made. Because the differences between this timeline, like the main one that we're in right now, and my theory timeline is, in the original, Tomen disbands and it's kind of chaos for a while until the 3 gangs rise up. But in this alternate timeline, essentially it's Tomen or Black Dragon, whatever the two. They're essentially eating every single gang around, and thus it's causing chaos in a different way. Instead of there being absolute free will and reign to do whatever with Toman gone, this is a monstrous, godly, like, divine gang. So instead of the 3 deities, it'll most likely just be the 2 deities. Black Dragon versus Rokuhara Tandai, because Rokuhara would most likely like be threatened, or whoever these people are, the South Tirano would most likely be threatened by the power of Black Dragon, and he'd want to rival it and take it down, which is why he would form the new version of Rokuhara Tendai, which this gang would most likely consist of Hanma among all the other kind of side villains that kind of just wouldn't be around because of the other gangs not like being there. Because Black Dragon would be defeating every other gang there, those other members would either join Black Dragon or they'd be kind of on their own and most likely join Rokuhara Tandai. And so the big final battle will most likely be Rokuhara Tandai versus Black Dragon / Toman. And from here, we have the strongest characters in the show. Like, imagining if Izana stays good, then he is an absolute beast who can beat Mikey, kind of. And of course, we have Mikey himself. We have Mikey's older brother, Shinichiro. We might potentially have Senju joining as well, because her older brother, Haruchio Senzu, is a big fanboy of Mikey, to which maybe she'd be joining Black Dragon because of him. So she might still be involved, which she's a very formidable opponent. And Kazutora is also really strong as well, so it would be all these absolute beasts. And of course, we can't forget about Draken, of course, right? We can't forget about him and all the other strong all the founders, essentially, and the leaders of Toman. We can't forget about all of them. I haven't mentioned them at all. But this would be a very insanely powerful gang. And of course, some of the villains may join them, which would make them even stronger. And so this would be a full-on brawl between Toman / Black Dragon versus Rokuhara Tandai. And in this, we could say maybe if Takemichi is still within this group, he would die, potentially, or he'll make it out alive. We can't really tell. And I know this all sounds like a lot, but most likely all this stuff would be quickly going through each arc. It's like, okay, so this is what happened here, and this is what happened here with this gang, and blah, blah, blah. And it would kind of just be a little recap of the few months that go by, to the point where it's like, okay, Takemichi goes, oh, well, there is one problem here. There's still this gang that shows up. We couldn't beat them in the alternate timeline in the previous one, which is the current timeline in the manga. But now with this gang, we can beat them. For sure. And that is how the 3 deities are still involved in this arc, because if we go back in the past and change it, they don't really exist. There is one little loose thread with all of this, and not many of you are going to care about it, but it's Hajime. Hajime turns evil because he couldn't save Akane. And Akane dies in the fire. Well, she doesn't die in the fire, but she dies due to the fire. And he then goes on to earn a bunch of money, and he gets obsessed with it. And he could honestly, either he'd remain a villain and we get a cool Seishu versus Hajime fight, which would be cool, or somehow with saving Shin, somehow he's able to either earn enough money to save Akane, or depending on the timeline of events, because I don't really know, to be honest, he's able to, maybe Seishu joins Black Dragon earlier, because I know that he was recruited by Shin, but I don't know when that happened. That might have been before or after. I'm not exactly too sure, to be completely honest. But perhaps he's recruited a little bit earlier or something. Because of this, maybe. I don't know, or that doesn't actually make sense. But maybe for some whatever reason, Hajime is able to save Akane instead, and thus he doesn't have to go through that whole money-hungry route of absolute evil that he goes on. That's one loose thread that I really want to see tied up, because I don't really know if they'd be able to save his character at all, or save Akane, because I know, speaking of saving the damsel in distress, Emma would come back, and that's exciting. I unironically, like, just not joking, I had a nightmare about that. I swear to God, I had a nightmare because of that. And I saw somebody, I don't know who it was, but it was somebody important to me, I guess, and they died, and it was, oh, that was a nightmare. All because of Emma. And speaking of women, I guess, we have Senju, which she has become a very major player in this arc. Because it's one thing to have Rokuhara Tandai in this final arc, like let's say they make her return as the villain. Senju kind of, she's like a stick in the plan or whatever. What's a phrase? She's like Spider-Man's foot in the gears that stop the clock, right? She kind of doesn't make this theory work, just from a writing perspective, because let's say they go back in the past, she's become a major part of this arc. What does she do, right? Does she join Black Dragon early on? Does she join the gangs 2 years before, or what? How does she get reintroduced in this alternate past timeline? That's the big question. And the one thing that I could think of is they've kind of been setting it up already, and I feel like people might either be extremely mad over this decision or they might be fine with it. But I feel like that she's going to end up with Takemichi by the end of this, because Hina would be with Kisaki most likely, or at the very least she wouldn't be with Takemichi. It's been set up that those two might end up together in some way. So with Senju being introduced, potentially that is the alternate love interest for Takemichi, because they have, I don't know if it's just me, but I really like them together. They have great chemistry. And Takemichi already has like an emotional attachment to her with seeing her die in the alternate timeline premonition that he got. And so I do think that she could potentially end up being the final love interest for Takemichi, and that is, if he doesn't die, he ends up with her. Because again, if this theory is true, what is the point of her character? Because it's, no matter how much these three deities are involved up until the end, if they're not involved at the end, then there's no point in them being here. And the same goes with Senju. She has to be involved in the end of the series now that she's been introduced in this final arc. And that's the one issue with this, I guess. Unless it's not an issue and she does end up with Takemichi. But I don't know. So yeah, I'm pretty sure that's all I needed to talk about. Shin lives, which means Mikey doesn't get the darkness, which means that he's kept under control, and thus he doesn't go evil and kill everybody in whatever alternate future. Kazutora doesn't go psycho, and he doesn't become evil. Izana most likely wouldn't turn evil either. He'd probably get his plot resolved with Shin. He'd probably be like, hey yo, I love you both. You may not be a brother to me literally, but you are a bro to me. Hajame's arc may be solved, I don't know. Emma's arc would be fixed, she'd live. Kisaki would get the girl of his dreams and he'd get a happy ending, which it's arguable if he deserves it or not. And everybody kind of just lives happily ever after, for the most part. Except for Takemichi, if he dies, then... Ooh. I guess Hanma probably wouldn't live happily ever after either, because most likely he'd get beat. But that's basically the theory. Because like I said at the beginning, it's not the initial theory itself that's big, it's the explaining what that affects. That is what's big. And this has turned out to be 35 minutes raw. Good lord, I thought this was going to be like an 8-minute, barely scratch that sweet money timer, but I guess not. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope I didn't royally mess something up and say something absolutely stupid, but whether or not this will happen, because we know that this is the final arc, but we don't know how long this arc is. We're about 15 chapters into this arc, and just looking at the number of chapters per arc, I was thinking, oh, maybe that'll give us a good idea of how long we have left. But the first arc was 12 chapters, second one is 21, third is 44, then the fifth is 44 as well, the sixth is 67, then the seventh is the 18 chapters. So to be honest, this could really range anywhere from literally next chapter to a whole year. We could literally get an entire year of Tokyo Revengers. So, and because it's the final arc, most likely it'll be a bit of a longer arc as well. So is there enough time to adapt all of this? Because most likely, like I said, because there will be a 2-year time skip after saving after Shinichiro, and we would cut back to like current time, right? Where the series is mostly taking place, the 12 years in the past. We'll most likely get there, and then we'll see the progression of each arc to see how it kind of skips over them and how certain arcs change a little bit, but most likely it'll just be a very quick, like, 1-chapter summary of like, okay, so this happened and this happened instead and blah, 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 to which then we get the big final battle, which means if this theory is true, this would have to happen within the next, like, I want to say 10 chapters. Within the next 10 or so chapters, we'd have to get Takemichi going back further into the past. And with Draken potentially dying, and at the moment we're on chapter 221, unless this video decides to come out after the chapter gets released, but right now we're uncertain as to if Draken lives or not. But if he dies, this would send Mikey over the edge, and we might see a little bit of a war. We'll most likely see a war between the three gangs, because that's what it's kind of leading up to, but most likely there'd have to be some kind of altercation during there, which would send Takemichi and Mikey, most likely be those two, into the past, which, much like how Takemichi is getting visions of the future, perhaps Shin would get visions of the future if they go back with Mikey, just because family relations, I don't know. I do think that they could adapt all of that into this final arc, because like I said, there's a year's worth of content here. They can most likely do that. This is most likely going to be a longer arc as well. So that's basically it for this video. I hope you enjoyed. Again, I hope I didn't royally mess something up here. So ending this video with a question: what other characters do you think Shin's not death will affect? Because I've already mentioned there's Kazutora, Hajime, possibly Senju, and there's also Kisaki and Hina. Izuma's obviously a big one as well, Emma, right? What other characters do you think this would affect, and how? I would love to hear your thoughts on that, because this is going to be, if this is how this series ends, and most likely with a Takemichi sacrifice, or he lives happily ever after with Senju, I wouldn't be mad either way. I think that'd be cool. Tokyo Revengers could do what Attack on Titan could not. And I would absolutely love to see what they do with this. And once the ending comes out, and if it's in a general idea of what I think it is, according to this theory, I definitely want to make a video comparing the two series, because they're very similar in a lot of ways, in a lot of odd ways. And if you guys want to see me talk about Tokyo Revengers some more, let me know down in the comments below, give this video a like, and I definitely would love to talk more about it, because I just love this series so much. It has me excited to watch anime again, and I've been missing that for like an entire year. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.